Hey there, I'm glad you're back. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. This is going to be one hell of a story as we dive deep into the paranormal archives of the Southeast Asia. Be comfortable, here I begin. It was a quiet evening in Kampung Laut Biru, the small coastal village nestled on the western shore of Sumatra in Indonesia. The sea stretched endlessly, blue waters glistening under the setting sun, and the warm breeze carried the scent of salt and fresh fish. Families worked side by side in this coastal town, their livelihoods tied to the unpredictable rhythm of the ocean. By 1980, the village had been unchanged for generations, with many living in small wooden homes on stilts, their backyards opening up to the sea. The people of Kampung Laut Biru were resilient, hardened by the hardships of life, but the sea was their lifeblood, offering sustenance, livelihood, and a sense of identity. Fishing was not merely a job. It was the core of their existence, handed down through the generations. On this particular evening, the Asmaro family, Pak Budi, Ibu Siti, and their 2 children were out on their small wooden boat, Kapal Pelita, anchored just a few meters from the shoreline. It was the time of day when the village's fishermen would gather their catch before heading home. The boat was laden with nets, each tangled with the silvery glint of fish, ikan tenggiri, mackerel, ikan Q, trevally, and the occasional ikan peri, stingray. Pak Budi was a seasoned fisherman, his hands calloused from years of pulling in nets, repairing them, and hauling in the weight of the ocean's bounty. Ibu Siti, a woman in her mid-30s, had spent her days helping her husband fish and preparing meals for the family. Their children, Rina and Danu, were accustomed to the rhythm of life by the sea. Pak, I think this will be a good catch today. Rina, their 14-year-old daughter, called out with excitement, her sharp eyes scanning the water. Pak Budi grinned, his teeth flashing white against his sun-weathered skin. Looks like we'll have enough for the market tomorrow, he replied, expertly pulling the net in. He nodded at Rina, his eldest child. She had inherited his skill, the quiet focus that came from years of working the waters. As they worked together, the familiar hum of the village filled the air, punctuated by the voices of other fishermen and the occasional squawk of seagulls circling above. Rina, be careful, Ibu Siti called, looking over her shoulder as she sorted through the smaller fish in their baskets. There's a storm brewing, I can feel it in my bones. Rina turned to her mother with a grin, her eyes sparkling. Mama, you're always saying that. It's just a little cloud. You're worrying too much. But there was a shadow in the sky, the clouds shifting with unsettling speed. Pak Budi glanced at the horizon, his expression suddenly serious. It wasn't like him to worry, but there was something in the air, a heaviness that pressed against his chest. We should start packing up, Pak Budi said quietly. This doesn't feel right. Ibu Siti's sharp instincts, honed over years of living by the sea, agreed. She grabbed Danu, her youngest, who was huddling next to her, watching the waves with wide eyes. Danu, only 8 years old, had inherited his mother's intuition but was far more prone to fear than his older sister. The boy had always been sensitive to the things others might dismiss, like the feeling of being watched or the strange sensation that something wasn't right. Mama, I don't like the look of the water, Danu whispered, his voice trembling. Ibu Siti bent down, smoothing his hair. It's just a storm, Anik. Nothing to be afraid of. We've been through worse. But even as she said the words, she didn't feel as reassured as she wanted to. Rina, still focused on the nets, glanced up and squinted at the sky. Her smile faded as she noticed the clouds thickening, rapidly consuming the blue sky. Pak, we need to go now, she urged. Before Pak Budi could answer, a low rumble echoed through the air, followed by a crack of thunder that vibrated in the air like a warning. In an instant, the fishermen in the area began pulling in their nets with haste, their faces drawn with urgency. The storm was coming faster than they anticipated. Get back to shore, everyone! Pak Harjo, a fisherman in his 50s, shouted from a neighboring boat. Storms like these are bad omens. Pak Harjo's warning sent a chill down the spine of every villager. There had been stories, old tales passed down from one generation to the next, of storms that brought more than just water. Some of the older fishermen would whisper of storms that seemed to carry an unnatural force, storms that seemed to stir the spirits beneath the waves. They spoke of how the sea was full of secrets, dark, ancient things that didn't take kindly to being disturbed. But such things were dismissed as superstition. Or were they? The Asmaro family, along with the others, raced toward the shore. The once calm water had turned choppy, waves crashing against the boats. The air grew thick with the smell of salt water and the metallic scent of an approaching storm. As they reached the shoreline, the villagers moved quickly, their bodies bent against the wind. The sky had turned a sickly greenish-gray, and lightning cracked across the heavens, illuminating the dark mass of clouds. "Let's go, let's go!" Pak Booty shouted, motioning for his family to hurry. The Asmaro family was not alone. Other families from the village, who had been fishing further out in the bay, arrived on the shore at the same time. There was Pak Jono, a large, jovial man in his mid-40s, with his wife Ibuhani and their two teenage sons, Iko and Artie. They all moved quickly, the younger boys carrying baskets filled with their catch as the adults hurried to secure their boats. There was also Pak Yuden, a quiet fisherman who rarely spoke, accompanied by his young daughter, Sari. The families exchanged hurried greetings and worried glances as the storm clouds rolled in. "We've got to get inside," Pak Jono said to Pak Booty, his voice urgent. "These storms, they bring something else. You ever heard of the Mambang? They say when the storms come like this, it means the Mambang is near." Pak Booty looked at him, his brow furrowing. "The Mambang? That's just an old story, Jono. Don't start with that again." But even as he said it, a sense of unease gnawed at him. He knew the stories. The Mambang was a spirit, a being that could possess people, especially children. It was said to bring misfortune, and sometimes death, wherever it went. It was an old fear among the people of the village, whispered about in hushed voices by the elders. And now, as the wind howled louder and the sea churned angrily, it felt as though those stories were suddenly very real. As they reached the safety of their homes, the storm unleashed its fury. The rain came down in sheets, pouring so heavily that it felt like a curtain of water had descended upon the village. The wind howled, slamming against the walls of the houses, and lightning split the sky, illuminating the village in brief flashes. Inside the Asmaro household, the warmth of the hearth was a small comfort against the storm raging outside. Ibu City quickly moved to the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of fried fish and rice. The sound of the storm was deafening, but there was something else, something subtle, that caught her attention. The wind carried with it whispers, faint voices that seemed to drift in and out, almost as if they were calling her name. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered. Danu, meanwhile, stood near the door, his small hands pressed against the wood. His eyes darted nervously around the room. There was something wrong, something that he couldn't explain. He had always been sensitive to the world around him, more aware of things that others couldn't see or feel. And tonight, something was watching him. He could feel it, its presence just beyond the doorway, waiting. "Mama," Danu whispered, his voice trembling. Ibu City looked up, startled. "What is it, Anik?" "I saw eyes," Danu whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Two eyes, they were watching me from outside the door. They were glowing, Mama, like they were alive." Ibu City turned slowly, her heart pounding. But there was nothing at the door, just the howling wind and the beating rain. She moved to him, bending down to comfort him. "It's just the storm, Dan. You're scared, that's all." She stroked his hair, but even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But Danu's eyes were wide with terror. "Mama, it's not the storm. It's something else." The storm raged outside the small wooden home. The rain poured heavily, slapping against the walls and windows, and the wind howled, shaking the palm trees that grew around the village. As if the environment itself had become the scene from a horror movie. Inside, the family huddled together, the only warmth in the room coming from a small kerosene lamp that flickered feebly in the corner. Danu, still shaken from the strange eyes he had seen earlier, sat by the door, his eyes wide, his tiny hands clutching his knees to his chest. He felt an odd chill in the air, despite the warmth of the fire. It was as if something was waiting. His mother, Ibusidi, had noticed the fear in his eyes and placed a hand on his head, still trying to comfort him. "Anik, it's just the storm. The wind is making noises. Maybe you just imagined it," she said softly, but even her voice trembled. She couldn't deny that something felt off about this storm. It was more than just the weather. It was as though the sea itself had come alive and was trying to tell them something. Pack Booty, standing by the window and peering out into the heavy downpour, turned and shook his head. "I don't like it either," he muttered, his voice tight. "This storm is too unnatural. The sea doesn't act like this unless something's wrong." At the mention of the sea, Ibusidi stiffened. She remembered the old stories her grandmother used to tell her, about the Mambang, the spirit that dwelled in the sea. It was a creature that could possess the living, cause misfortune, and bring storms when it was angered. But those were just old tales, weren't they? Only for children to be scared of. Suddenly, the door creaked. Danu jumped, his heart pounding. He looked up, his eyes scanning the small wooden room. He had heard it, faint whispers, like voices calling from outside. "Mama," Danu whispered, his voice trembling. "The eyes, they're back." Ibusidi turned, about to comfort her son again, but before she could speak, the door creaked open slightly, as if nudged by an invisible hand. A cold draft rushed in, sending a chill across the room. The light from the kerosene lamp flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows on the walls. Danu's eyes widened, and he quickly crawled toward his mother, his small feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "I'll go check," Pack Booty said, trying to hide his own unease. He moved toward the door and peered outside into the darkness. All he could see was the rain, the dark silhouette of palm trees swaying violently, and the faint light of other homes in the distance. But there was nothing else, no eyes staring back at him, no shapes in the mist. "It's nothing," Pack Booty said after a moment, his voice forced, as if trying to convince himself. "Just the wind and the rain." But Ibusidi wasn't so sure. She had grown up hearing about storms like this. There were whispers among the older villagers that when the sea grew restless, when the winds howled and the sky turned dark, it was a sign of something watching them, something that had been asleep for a long time. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, a soft, rhythmic knock, as though someone was trying to get in. It wasn't the wind, this was deliberate. Pack Booty's hand froze on the door handle. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no answer, just the steady sound of rain and thunder. Ibusidi, her heart pounding, glanced around the room. The walls were simple, wooden planks nailed together to form a humble shelter. A hammock swung lazily in one corner, the familiar scent of dried fish and wood smoke in the air. A few simple mats were scattered on the floor, and the fire in the hearth crackled quietly. It was a home, simple and warm, but tonight it felt cold and unfamiliar. "Maybe it's one of the other families," Ibusidi suggested, trying to break the tension. "Perhaps they're just seeking shelter from the storm." Pack Booty nodded, but even as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He walked over to the door, and with a heavy sigh, he opened it slightly. A gust of wind rushed in, blowing his hair back. But there was no one there. "There's nobody here," Pack Booty said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I swear, I heard a knock, but there's nothing outside. Just the storm." Ibusidi took a deep breath and moved toward the door, glancing around cautiously. "Perhaps it's just our imagination, Pack. We've been out in the sun all day, working hard. It's easy to mistake the wind for something else." Pack Booty looked at her, his face pale. Maybe it is, he didn't believe it. Something about this storm, this night, felt unnatural. But he didn't want to scare his wife any more than she already was. As they stood there in silence, the storm continued to rage. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, hammering against the roof and walls. The wind howled like an animal in pain, shaking the walls of their home. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The wind fell silent, and the rain slowed. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, and for a moment, everything was eerily still. "Did you hear that?" Ibusity asked, her voice barely a whisper. Pack Booty nodded. "Yes, it's gone now." But before they could react, the sound of faint footsteps echoed from outside. Soft, slow, like someone was walking in the mud. Heavy footsteps, like they were dragging something behind them. "What in the world?" Pack Booty muttered, his eyes wide. "It's getting closer." The door creaked again, this time on its own, as if someone, or something, was gently pushing it open. Ibusity's heart raced. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. But before she could touch the handle, a voice echoed through the house. Faint, barely audible, it called, "Danu." Danu froze, his body going rigid. The voice was soft, almost coaxing, as if it was beckoning him. His little heart hammered in his chest. "Mama, it's calling me." Danu's voice cracked, filled with fear. Ibusity spun around, her face pale with dread. "No, Anik, it's not real." But even as she said it, she could feel the air grow colder, the hairs on her neck standing up. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, like they were moving of their own accord. Pack Booty's face darkened, his mind racing. This was no ordinary storm. As the storm continued its violent rampage, the village of Kampung Laut Biru felt like it was on the edge of something far worse than just bad weather. The rain had intensified, pouring in torrents from the sky, and the winds grew stronger. Inside their homes, the villagers huddled together, muttering prayers and clutching their belongings. It was clear that this wasn't just another storm, it was a warning. A warning from the sea. At Pack Booty's house, the Asmaro family gathered around their small table, their faces tense. The once comforting smell of the wood-burning stove was now tinged with the bitter scent of fear. "Pack Booty, what's happening to the sea?" Ibusity asked, her voice cracking. She tried to hide the fear in her eyes, but Danu, sitting on her lap, could feel the tension in the room. His tiny hands squeezed his mother's, and his gaze darted nervously toward the window. Pack Booty, who had been standing near the window staring out into the rain-soaked night, turned around slowly. His brow was furrowed, the lines on his face deepened by the stress of the past few hours. He didn't know how to answer. "It's not normal," he said, his voice low. "The waves, they're too high for this time of year. And that wind, it feels wrong. Something's different about this storm." "Different how?" Ibusity asked, her voice sharp with the desperation to understand. "There have been storms before. We've survived worse." "I'm not talking about the rain," Pack Booty said, his eyes narrowing. "This is unnatural." At that moment, the door to their house creaked. Ibusity jumped, clutching Danu tighter. Pack Booty's face went pale. Everyone in the room went still, listening. The door swung open slightly, pushed by a gust of wind, and then there was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from outside. "Pack Booty, what was that?" Ibusity whispered. Pack Booty's heart raced as he walked slowly toward the door, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He placed his hand on the door handle but hesitated. What if it wasn't the wind? What if it was real? With a deep breath, he swung the door open and stepped out onto the porch. The rain hit him immediately, drenching him, but he saw nothing. No one was there. The dark shadows of the village were all around him, but there was no figure, no sign of life other than the relentless storm. "Nothing," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Just the wind." As he stepped back inside, The door slammed shut with an unnatural force. Danu jumped in his mother's arms, and even Pack Booty looked uneasy. "This is not normal," Pack Booty repeated, though it wasn't clear if he was trying to convince his family or himself. The small house, with its wooden walls and thatched roof, had always been a safe haven from the world's storms. But tonight, it felt fragile, as if it could crumble at any moment. The table where they sat was a simple wooden plank, scarred by years of use. Nearby, the hammock swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. A few dried fish hung from the ceiling, their glossy scales reflecting the lamp's light, but even their stillness felt ominous. Danu could barely hear his own thoughts over the howling wind, but he felt a strange weight in the room, like something was watching them. He glanced around, his eyes catching the barest flicker of movement near the window, a shadow moving just beyond the rain. "Mama?" Danu whispered, his voice barely audible. Ibusity's hand gripped his tightly. "It's just the storm, Anik." "But Mama," the eyes. "I saw them." Pack Booty turned sharply, his expression hardening. "What do you mean, eyes?" "I saw them when I was outside," Danu said, his voice shaking. "Two eyes following me. From the tree line." "Don't be silly," Ibusity said, though her voice trembled. "It's just the storm playing tricks on you." But Pack Booty didn't speak. He knew better than to dismiss such things. He had heard the old stories about the Mambang that roamed the shores, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. There had been whispers in the village for years, but no one had taken them seriously. Not until now. "Maybe it's time to go to the others," Pack Booty said, his voice soft but urgent. "We need to be together, everyone. This storm is too strong. There's something wrong. The sea, the wind, it's all wrong." The family quickly gathered their things, grabbing what they could carry. Danu felt the eyes again, only this time, they seemed closer. He looked around the room. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched lingered. As they walked through the village, the sound of the storm seemed to drown out everything else. But as they neared the homes of their neighbors, they heard the familiar murmurs of villagers gathering, whispers of fear and confusion, some of the old ones muttering prayers under their breath. The villagers gathered in silence around Pack Harjo, their faces etched with worry. The storm still raged above them, the sound of it deafening. But now, they all knew it wasn't just the weather. Something far worse was coming. "We can't let it take anyone else," Pack Booty said, his voice firm. He turned to the crowd, looking each of them in the eye. "We need to work together. If we all make our stand now, we can still save the village." As the villagers prepared to perform the old rituals, the storm howled louder, as if the sea itself was protesting. But despite the fear in their hearts, they knew they had no choice. They had to face the Mambang, or risk losing everything. The winds howled, but this time, it wasn't just the storm, it seemed to carry whispers from the deep, the same whispers that had haunted the village for years. As the villagers huddled together, their eyes filled with fear and uncertainty, they knew something had to be done. But what? The elders, led by Pack Harjo, had called for an emergency meeting, urging the villagers to prepare for the ritual. The Mambang had returned, and it demanded an offering, a tribute of blood, to quiet its anger. "It's the only way," Pack Harjo had said, his voice grave, eyes wide with the burden of knowledge. "The Mambang has always taken from us, and if we don't give it what it wants, it will take more. It's been years since we had to offer anything, but now we must make a sacrifice." The word, sacrifice, hung in the air like a death sentence. Danu, the young boy, had heard rumors in the village. Whispers passed between families about strange disappearances in the night, about villagers who would vanish without a trace, only for their bodies to be found near the shoreline, mangled and half-drowned. The Mambang had claimed them, just as it had taken others in the past. And now, the storm was a clear sign that it was hungry again. As the village gathered near the shore, the elders began the preparations for the ritual. They weren't just performing an ordinary ceremony, this was the last-ditch effort to save them all. They would offer the spirit of the sea the blood of the guilty, the criminals who had wronged the village in some way, to appease the Mambang. The price was steep, but the villagers knew there was no other way. If they did not offer the Mambang what it wanted, it would begin to pick them off one by one, starting with the youngest, the weakest. The elders chose carefully. No one was to know the exact details of the crimes committed by those selected, but they all knew the guilty were the ones who had hurt the village, or perhaps worse, those who had gotten away with terrible wrongs. By the sea, in the shadow of the ancient shrine, the villagers formed a circle. The ground was wet, the salt air thick on their tongues. The elders had already placed offerings of fish and seaweed in the middle of the circle, but there was one more offering to be made. One last, dark task remained. Pak Harjo stepped forward, holding a small dagger, its blade gleaming under the dim light of the lanterns. He raised it high, and the villagers fell silent. "These are the ones," Pak Harjo said, his voice steady despite the storm. He motioned to 3 men who stood at the center of the circle. Each of them had their heads bowed in shame. The first man was Pak Armin, a former fisherman who had once been a respected member of the village. But his greed had driven him to betray his fellow villagers. He had been the one to sell off their fishing grounds to outsiders, allowing strangers to trawl their waters and take what wasn't theirs. His actions had nearly destroyed the community's livelihood. The second was Budi, a young man whose hands were stained with blood, literally. He had been the village's blacksmith, and though no one knew for sure, it was believed that he had killed his own father over a dispute about inheritance. The older villagers still whispered about the strange events leading up to his father's death, how the old man had been found with his throat slit and his body dumped in the river. But Budi had escaped justice. The third was Martin, an outsider who had come to the village only a few months prior. No one really knew where he had come from, but his presence had unsettled everyone. He had been involved in several shady dealings, stolen goods, drunken brawls, and even threats made to the village's women. But the worst of his crimes had yet to be revealed. Martin had been the one who led the villagers to believe that they had been cursed, blaming the Mambang for their misfortunes when, in reality, he had been the one sowing distrust and chaos. Each of these men stood bound, their wrists tied with rough rope, their faces pale with fear. The villagers were silent, not looking at the condemned, but at the dark sky above, as if praying that the Mambang would show mercy. "This is the cost," Pak Harjo murmured, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. "The sea spirit does not care for justice, only for appeasement. We must offer it these sacrifices to prevent the Mambang from claiming more lives." Pak Armin, his face contorted with guilt and fear, whispered, "Please spare us. We were only trying to survive. I never meant for it to go this far." But his words were lost to the winds, swallowed by the storm. The sea churned ominously, as though it was waiting for the ritual to begin. Without warning, the first man, Pak Armin, was pushed forward. He stumbled to his knees as the villagers turned their eyes away, unwilling to witness the true horror of what had to be done. Pak Harjo raised his dagger, the sharp edge catching the faint light of the lanterns, and with a quick motion, he struck. There was a sickening sound as the blade sank deep into Pak Armin's chest. He gasped, blood spilling out in dark rivers, staining the sand beneath him. The wind howled louder, and for a moment, the world seemed to tremble with the force of the sacrifice. The storm seemed to quiet for a moment, and then the Mambang revealed itself, though not fully. The water around them darkened, and the shadows of the sea seemed to stretch toward the shore. The villagers held their breath, knowing they had done what was necessary. But as the storm raged on, they felt no peace. Instead, they felt the weight of the Mambang's presence, pressing in on them, cold and relentless. As the ritual continued with the deaths of Budi and Martin, the villagers stood in silence. They had been taught that these sacrifices were necessary for their survival, that the Mambang was a force beyond their understanding. But they never knew the full truth. Years ago, an entire village had been wiped out, another coastal community far to the south. The story had been buried, whispered about by elders, but the true cause of the massacre was never revealed. It was not the Mambang that had destroyed them, but the elders of that village who had, in desperation, turned to darker sacrifices. Those sacrifices, like the ones now happening in Kampung Laut Biru, were the real cause of the village's ruin. And the Mambang, it never revealed its true form, because it didn't need to. It simply fed on the guilt, the fear, the endless cycle of sacrifice that would continue for generations. As the ritual came to an end, the storm began to subside, the winds dying down, the sea calming, but something was wrong. One of the village children, Hadi, a curious boy of about 10, had been sneaking behind the bushes near the ritual site. He had heard the chanting, seen the shadows, and couldn't resist the pull of the forbidden. But as he watched, his eyes widened with horror. His small hands trembled as he crouched in the dark, watching the villagers begin to disperse. But then something caught his eye. The eyes of the Mambang, those glowing, otherworldly eyes, seemed to flicker, almost as if they were looking at him. Hadi blinked, feeling the coldness of the gaze piercing his soul. It was as though the Mambang knew he had seen too much. He turned to run, but his body felt heavy, his limbs stiff. He stumbled back, his heart racing, and when he looked up again, he felt something strange in his own eyes. They burned as though the Mambang had marked him. His vision blurred, the shadows around him growing darker, deeper. When he finally made it back to his home, his mother looked at him with a start. "Hadi, what happened to you?" But Hadi's eyes, they weren't the same. They glowed, darkness visible in his pupils, a reflection of the presence of a demon. And as he looked at her, a cold smile tugged at his lips. "Mama, the sea is calling me." If you loved the story, please hit a like, drop a comment, and do consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means a lot, and we shall bring more engaging content in the future. Thank you very much.